Welcome aboard. I'm glad you're here with me, so thanks for dialing in. But today we're going to look at a topic that's really pretty intense as far as the culture goes today, especially in the Christian culture of the church. And the topic is a continuation of the series of Alice that I started several months ago. And we talked about last week a little bit more, and yeah, we're going to take a look at that today. Again, so far in Alice, we've looked at how love is sometimes chosen over the bitterness that stays in the human heart and comes out as racism, in a person's life. Racism is one of those things that it's kind of ingrained in society. It's ingrained in the culture. We have this natural tendency to look at people and to judge people and to elevate ourselves above certain peoples and so forth. And it comes out as racism. Last week we talked about how as a Christian, as looking to overcome racism in my life, in my heart, that it's really only God that can change the human heart. I can protest and I can enact laws and we can do all kinds of things to try and combat the problem of racism in our world, our lives, our culture, and so forth. But in reality, I might be able to force people to do certain things or to live under certain laws or guidelines, but it really is only God that can change the human heart, to where racism is not an issue. We talked about that last week. Now, the topic I want to get into today is one that's near and dear to a lot of people's hearts, and that is the idea of reparations. Reparations are basically the making of amends for a wrong that somebody has done. It might be by paying money or other resources that are being paid to another individual who was oppressed or who was wronged by somebody. The question is, does the Bible address the issue of, reparations or the repayment of things? And actually it does. I don't have it on the screen here, I don't think. No, I do not. I'm going to ask you to take a look at this on your own time. It's Leviticus 6, verses 1 through 5. And I'm going to read it for you. And here's what it says. It says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, when a person sins and acts unfaithfully against the Lord by lying to another concerning something left in storage." In other words, if somebody puts something in storage, maybe you have control over, and you decide that you want it, so you lie to them about it was stolen by somebody else or whatever. So when a person sins and acts unfaithfully against the Lord by lying to another concerning something left in storage or entrusted to him, or theft, or by extorting his neighbor, or by finding a lost item concerning one of all the things that a man may do to sin in these things. When he sins and he is found guilty, he shall return whatever he stole, whatever he extorted, whatever was left in storage with him, or the lost item which he found, or about which he swore falsely. Then he shall repay it in full and shall add 1/5 to it. In other words, tack on another 20%. And he shall give it to whom it belongs on the day that he's found guilty. What is all this saying? In a nutshell, what God is saying, that when you wrong somebody, whether you lied or you cheated them or you stole something from them, whatever the case might be. But when we wrong somebody and we admit that we did something wrong to that person, we're to repay that person with interest. And the idea is very simple. It's that, I took something from somebody that it didn't belong to me, so I took it, and to show that my heart really is repentant and that I want to, be forgiven for the sin of my life here. I give it back to the person, I confess it to them, and then I also give them a little bit more. The assumption is that, back in those days, let's say you had 10 sheep, and a guy had a whole bunch of sheep and you took 10 of them. Well, when you realize that, I shouldn't have taken those sheep, so I give him back the 10 plus 2 more because, those sheep would have reproduced. They would have added benefit, to his wealth and all because they would have reproduced and things. So God is saying that that's a way that you can compensate that individual for them having lost something, by your hand. You're the one that stole it, so now you need to give it back to them, and then you need to give them a little bit extra because, that's a way of showing remorse, as well as compensating them for, should the money, increase due to interest or whatever the case might be. Reparations are the repayment of something with interest for something that was done by another person, done to another person. In the world today, we see a lot, especially in Christian cycles, we see this idea of reparation associated with slavery. And we have to consider what slavery was back in Jesus' day and what it means in the world today. Well, if you were a slave owner today, let's just say that, each one, let's say we owned a slave, and we realized that this is wrong. And you went to release that person, you said, I'm sorry that I enslaved you and this was wrong and I shouldn't have done that, to you. You're free to go now. If that was the case today, would I owe that person some kind of compensation? I think most of us would agree, yeah, we do. We offended that person. We oppressed that person. We without, them freely giving in, we oppressed them and turned them into a slave, and now we owe them something for that. I think most of us would agree that we need to compensate that person for the wrong that we imposed on their life. Well, what was slavery like back in Jesus' day, back in biblical times? We have to understand what slavery means today as well as what it meant back in those days, especially as we read certain scriptures in regards to it. In biblical times, people were enslaved for basically a couple of different reasons. One of them was they were forced into labor. Another way that people were enslaved back then was when they made a commitment to an individual to work for them. Let me explain. Forced slavery would be an example of where the Egyptians were hauled off and taken into Egypt, and they were enslaved by the Egyptians. They were forced to build, all kinds of cities and things of that nature. It wasn't something that they chose to do. This was something that the Egyptians forced them to do. That's what we traditionally understand as slavery. But back in Jesus' day, in the nation of Israel and before Jesus' day, slavery was also something different. Slavery was something that was chosen. In other words, let me put it to you this way. Let's say an Israelite owned a bunch of property, and he had crops and fields and all that stuff. And he needed people to work those fields and to gather the harvest and things. So he would, quote, enslave another person, or that person would voluntarily agree to the terms of this slavery or this working for this man under certain conditions. And the conditions were prescribed by God to the Israelite nation. There were legal codes that were established that protected the person who was enslaved to the landowner, so that the person was treated fairly, that they weren't ripped off, that the landowner provided, money and food and shelter and all of the things that the person enslaved needed to live, as well as for his own family. So it was really more like, accepting a job, if you will. And, but there were other conditions too. Slavery, let's say I went to an Israelite landowner and I'm like, I have a debt that I need to pay, so can I borrow some money? And the guy said, okay, you can borrow this money, but now you have to come and work for me, until it's paid off. Well, you could do that. You could borrow the money and go pay your debts, and then you would work for that landowner. While at the same time he paid you for your efforts and for your work, he also had to provide for your sustenance. He had to provide for you and for your family. If you were in that situation and you were enslaved to an Israelite, your freedom could be purchased at any point in time. You come back, halfway through and say, well, here, I got the rest of the money I owe you. Here you go. And that was the end of it. You were released. Also, God had established that the slaves of Israelites would be released on what was called the Jubilee year. In other words, on the 7th year of their enslavement, they were to be released freely. You could enslave someone or hire someone, if you want to look at it that way, for a period of 6 years, and at the beginning of the 7th year, you were to release that person automatically. That was God's law. So it wasn't like you would be enslaved forever. You were enslaved to the point to where you owed that person money, or you needed food and shelter for you and your family, and it was agreed upon and provided for from the Israelite. And anywhere in between, if you wanted to get out of it, you could pay whatever debt was owed to you. Or you could wait till the Jubilee year, the 7th year, and you were automatically set free. That when that landowner released that person from the enslavement, that they were to be provided for very generously. In other words, you just don't say, okay, your time's up, see ya. No, you would provide for that person out of the abundance that God had given to you. So enslavement in the nation of Israel was way different than what our traditional understanding of enslavement is all about, especially like when Israel was enslaved by the Egyptians. In Deuteronomy 15, these are some of the instructions that God gives to the nation of Israel. And he says, when you let him go free from you. So when you let that person free from this agreement or this contract or this enslavement, he says, you shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, animals, food, out of your threshing floor, grains, and so forth, and also out of your winepress, food, drink. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. See, so this was really not a bad deal. It was kind of like, excuse me, like our Social Security system of today, where, Social Security provides needs for people that are, in a bad spot. Well, this was the same thing. The Israelites could bring a person in to work for them, but then there were certain obligations that they had. The difference between a couple of slaveries is, of course, when Israel was enslaved by Egypt, that was forced. They had no choice. It was either do it or die. But when an Israelite went into an agreement with an individual to be enslaved to that household, it was with all of these benefits, really. They were to be paid, they were to be fed, they were to be sheltered. There was all kinds of things that they were required to do for the benefit of the individual. From these scriptures and from these stories, we learn a couple of things about God. We learn that, number one, God is a God of justice. He holds each and every person accountable for the things that they do. He holds each and every person accountable for the wrongs that they do. So as a Christian, if I harm another person, God tells me that if you want to make restitution, if you want to repent of what you have done and you want to restore the relationship, then yeah, you have to confess it to the person, but you also need to, give back to that person what it is that you took from that person, with interest. Look at Zacchaeus. Remember the story of Zacchaeus? Zacchaeus was the little short tax collector, and Jesus was walking along a road one day, and there was a group of people with him, and Zacchaeus wanted to see this Jesus. He wanted to see who he was. But because Zacchaeus was short, he couldn't really see over and into the crowd. So he climbs a tree, and Jesus comes walking by, and the rest of the story is kind of history. Jesus engages with Zacchaeus, and Zacchaeus comes down, and Zacchaeus accepts who Jesus is. And basically, Zacchaeus said that, as a tax collector, for any of the people that I have ripped off, I'm going to repay them fourfold. So if I ripped you off of $100, I'm going to give you $400 back. He kind of took this demand of God for restoration. He took it to an extreme. He wanted to make sure that, that the people understood, and that his own heart understood that he was sorry and repented about the wrongs that he had done toward other people. So Zacchaeus gave back fourfold. I want you to see that God's justice does not mean that he is holding individuals accountable for things that they did not do themselves. That's not in the scriptures. I don't see it anywhere where God holds me personally responsible for the wrongs maybe that were committed to another person years and years ago, maybe even generations ago. In a nutshell, God tells us, if you wrong another person, you got to repay that person. Today the argument is this, and it's in the culture and it's in the Christian church as well. And that is, should a group of people who did not commit the injustice compensate another group of people who did not suffer the injustice? You see? That's the issue that's kind of going through the world and the culture today, and the protest and, government and even the Christian church is, what is our responsibility toward people that were maybe oppressed generations ago? Do we owe them something? Well, first of all, as I've said several times now, if you wrong somebody, you owe them, and you owe them with interest. If your ancestors wronged somebody, I don't think we owe them. I don't see it in Scripture anywhere that we owe somebody for something that ancestors that I never met, that I never knew, that they did to these people. However, and don't miss this, this in no way removes our responsibility as Christians to care for the poor, to help our neighbor, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. It in no way removes my responsibility to show kindness and compassion to people that are down on their luck. The same situation still is here with me, and that is that if I see somebody in need, as a Christian, I'm called and as with responsibility to share with that person the resources that God has so richly blessed me with. None of that has changed. So in regards to this issue of reparations and who owes who what, again, if I did something to you, I owe you. If I oppressed you in some way, then I owe you with interest. But if I didn't, if somebody else did generations ago, and maybe, I don't really owe you for that because I had no control over it. But what I do have control over is how I respond to your needs today as a Christian. So when you look at reparations, I don't think the Christian church owes for wrongs that were committed centuries ago, or any Christian individual. However, we do have a responsibility as Christ followers to share with others the love of Christ, the resources that he has blessed us so richly with, and to do all that we can to love our neighbor as ourselves, to build them up, to help them, to be compassionate, and to just be the person that Christ was when he was here on this earth. So today I want you to think about that and really let it kind of, settle in your heart over the rest of this week, so that we might come to a better understanding of how the church and maybe our individual churches or our individual families should respond to this whole issue of who owes who what. Remember the love of Christ and remember what Christ has done for each and every one of us. Thanks, and God bless, and I'll see you next week. Tough Questions for God is a teaching ministry of the Rosebush United Methodist Church, where we challenge our faith with some of the most difficult issues. Tough Questions for God is available on Facebook Live, Sundays at 11:30 a.m., or go on our website at toughquestionsforgod.org and just follow the links on the homepage for YouTube or via podcast. Thanks for joining, and don't forget to like and share. God bless.